Then I think if you both don't mind, I'm just going to wait a few
Sure.
minutes just to see if anyone comes into this meeting.
Do you want me to stop sharing for now?
Nope, this seems totally fun. Nice background.
Okay. There we go. How's that one?
Even better. Alrighty, I don't want to keep you all waiting, so I guess we can start this meeting. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final Conway PIP meeting. PIP stands for Public Involvement Plan. Today is May 25th, and the time is 6:33. My name is John Bronincant, and I'm the Public Space Planner for the Public Space and Urban Forestry Department for the City of Somerville. I also want to introduce Colin Ziegler, who is the environmental coordinator for the city and one of the points of contacts for the city in regards to the site's remediation. Comments and questions are welcome. Please feel free to drop your comments in the chat tool or raise your hand. The raise hand feature is at the bottom, and I will allow you to speak and you can pose your questions. We can allow for a few questions kind of during the presentation, but if they start to get a little bit longer, I think we'll just hold all the questions until the end. I just wanted to thank all of you for attending and thank all the staff and consultants here at the meeting for their support and involvement with the project. I also want to thank several of our other partners involved in this project who have attended previous meetings but aren't here tonight. From the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection is Eric Johnson, who is the DEP project manager for the Conway project. Also from Mass DEP is Karen Stromberg, who manages the PIP process for the entire state. We will dive into this PIP process in just a moment, but first I wanted to give a little background for the project before handing it off to George and Joe to present the items pertaining to the PIP. A little bit about this process. DEP ensures that the public is involved in and aware of the remedial actions that occurred at the Conway site. The purpose of this meeting is to present the draft final activities and use limitation, AUL, and the permanent solution statement, PSS, for the site, and to solicit feedback from the public on these two documents. Licensed site professionals from Weston Sampson and the city staff will discuss the final documents for the PIP, as well as answer any questions. The AUL and PSS will be available for review starting today, May 25th, at the Conway Park PIP website and at the information or reference desk at the 3 Somerville Public Library branches. Now I will introduce the two licensed site professional consultants from Weston Sampson, George Naslas and Joe Spencer, to talk about the project.
Great. Thank you very much. Can everyone see the presentation okay? Great.
Yes.
So we'll have a little introduction. John's already given a great overview of what the public information plan, the PIP process is. Going to do a recap. I know a bunch of you have probably joined us on previous meetings, but we'll run through site background and the timeline. And we'll talk about regulatory closure and then specifics about the permanent solution statement, the activity and use limitation documents, which are available for review. And then we'll go through what the next steps are. So as John mentioned, we've got the public information process, plan process. What we are presenting tonight is, as I said, an overview of the project and a description of the report. The report's close to 1,000 pages long, so I'm not going to go through every single page. I'm just going to give an overview of kind of the sections and then information about where you can find this report for review, and then the process to get comments to us in the written form so we can address them. Those comments will be addressed and, where appropriate, incorporated into the report, and certainly that response will be included in the final report. I'm part of the Western and Samson project team. We work with the city throughout this whole project. My colleague Joe Spencer is with us today. There are other couple of major players. There was the EPA cleanup team, led by EPA's emergency removals program. And we also had the field construction team, which was Quirk Construction. Importantly about this project is it was complicated from a regulatory side. We had both EPA requirements under CERCLA, and we also had state requirements under the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. And the approach that you'll see that we took and how we got through the whole process had to satisfy both EPA and the state throughout. And what this culminated in is what we're presenting today, or what's available for your review, is the permanent solution statement report. That report is supported by an activity and use limitation. And we're going to go through both of those towards the end of the presentation. But basically, the permanent solution statement is the final closure report that goes to the state, that summarizes all the work that's been done, why we can close out the site. It has risk characterization information, it has all the data, and it's supported by an activity and use limitation that stipulates what future uses can and can't be. So a little recap. Conway Park, this is an aerial pre-remediation. The ball fields are in their previous configuration of the baseball diamonds, I should say. And what's important about this figure is you can see the site constraints. You can see the commuter rail line along the bottom, residences along the east side, the rink on the west side with access around the rink, the playground on the north side, and some of the lab. And as you can see from this picture, there's not a lot of easy ways in and out of this site. And that was important when we designed the remedial solution. Now, this site has been around for a long time. This is a figure from 1852. And down in the bottom here is the area where Conway Park is currently. The hill behind it is Spring Hill, where the school sits. And you can also see the rail lines on this map. The site was developed sometime in the 1800s. It was a bleachery and dye works, which operated until the 30s. And what's interesting about this old map that shows the outline of the works, they actually spread, they included the current Conway Park field site and spread onto where the area which is now under the ring, all the way across the port, and extended from some of the land down to the rail line. The buildings were demolished sometimes in the 30s and early 40s. Fields were discussed around the 40s, but we don't have much information when the first fields were constructed, but they were renovated in the 70s and in early 2000s. So our project history, this began with an initial investigation in 2017. We were looking initially at a failing wall that was rotating in the southeast corner of the site adjacent to a residence. And as part of that investigation and figuring out how we would replace the wall, we did some soil sampling behind the wall And knowing that renovation of the park was coming, we were asked to do some additional general characterization across the site. Well, what we found was elevated lead and PCBs in soil at quite high numbers. And in early 2018, we did a supplemental investigation. This resulted in notification to Mass DEP and EPA. Throughout the rest of 2018, we did fairly extensive soil assessment to support both the federal requirements under the Toxic Substance Control Act, as well as the state's Massachusetts Contingency Plan regulation. In 2019, we continued with some source assessment, looking at some of the areas of the field where we believe was the source of the contamination, and you'll see some pictures of that in a minute. We developed a remedial strategy. We brought EPA's emergency removals team to the table and met with them a few times, and they came forth with an offer to remediate portions of the site, which was very generous of them, and it's not something that's typically done at many sites. Throughout 2019, a work share agreement was agreed to between EPA and the city, and we developed a path forward that would achieve regulatory closure in conjunction with park redevelopment. We did a phase 1 in early 2019 in March, and that triggered the public information plan process. We received a petition from interested residents to be involved in the process. The park and remedial design occurred in 2020, got finalized, went out to bid, and the remediation and redevelopment occurred in 2021 into early 2022. We achieved regulatory closure under the federal requirements in 2022, and here we are with the final report that's going to go to the state here in 2020. So Joe, I'll turn it over to you, and you can give us an overview and just give me a nod, and I'll advance the slides as you need.
Great, thanks, George. Yeah, so I'll just give a brief overview of the environmental assessment and remediation that we've done at the site, just to remind everybody how we got to where we are now. As George said, initial assessment began in 2017. It was limited. It was based on a pretty basic field resurfacing and retaining wall repair, but we did detect PCBs and lead at elevated concentrations. From 2017 through the summer of 2018, we conducted several subsurface soil assessments, each sort of building on the last in an iterative fashion. As we began to build the data set, sorry, George, back one slide. Thank you. As we began to build the data set, we identified 3 separate areas of the park showing very different average and maximum concentrations of PCBs and different exposure scenarios, which led to, I'm sure everyone is aware, the closure of the ballpark area and the southeastern or eastern portion of the playground, which was done out of an abundance of caution and in consultation with Mass DEP and EPA. Next slide, please. Once it became evident that PCBs are present in soil site-wide, we knew we had to satisfy requirements, as George said, under the federal regulations, which we call TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, as well as the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, the state regulations. So we designed the summer 2018 comprehensive sampling program to meet the requirements of risk-based closure under both sets of regulations. In total, we collected and analyzed over 700 soil samples for PCBs from more than 100 soil boring locations. They were placed at nodes of an approximate 50-foot grid with added density in the suspected source area, which was in the southwestern baseball diamond centered around the pitcher's mound and the first baseline. This was a depth integrated program. We collected samples over multiple depth intervals at each boring locations from the ground surface all the way down to the observed bottom fill material, which ranged from just a few feet below ground surface on the northern portion of the site near Somerville Ave to upwards of 12, 13 feet below ground surface on the southern portion of the site. Next slide, please. So this is the sampling plan that shows, from a plan view, how many sample locations, how many boring locations we actually had. It was very comprehensive, very complete sampling program. It allowed us to make decisions quickly with respect to remedial design, and again, satisfy both sets of regulations. Next slide, please. So in 2019, we performed some additional assessment that was focused on source identification. The two figures you see here are portions of figures generated by our geophysical survey subcontractor. And these show anomalies in the subsurface. You can see, this is the southern portion of the site, and you can see the southwestern baseball diamond in its former configuration. And these the red area centered around the first baseline shows as an obvious anomaly where there might be buried metal. The next slide, please. During the test pitting that we performed immediately after the geophysical survey, we found what we believe to be the source of the original release of the site, which are these wax paper capacitors. We did analytical testing. These are known. These are known to have very high PCB concentrations. We did analytical testing on these and confirmed that PCB concentrations in these wax paper capacitors, despite being decades old and dry, were very elevated. In some cases, more than twice the highest concentrations we saw in soil at the site. Next slide, please. And so our remedial design was developed in close cooperation with EPA and Mass DEP. The overall approach was to mitigate risk and comply with the strict TSCA requirements, which have very strict, sampling resolution requirements, while limiting soil removal to control costs and minimizing the impact to the neighborhood. The design focused on removing soil with PCB concentrations of equal to or greater than 50 parts per million, and reusing soil concentrations with less than 50 parts per million, while also implementing a cover system in the ballpark area to prevent direct exposure to soil in the future. We also excavated soil having greater than 1 part per million concentration of PCBs from the playground area, again, as a conservative measure. Next slide, please. So these are two cross sections. These are cross sections of the two cover system options that were implemented at the site. On the left, there's the synthetic turf field cross section. This system was a total of 18 inches of coverage from existing soil, including drainage stone and a geotextile fabric and an artificial turf mat, a shock pad, and then natural cork infill. And then on the right-hand side, you see a more traditional soil cover system, which is 3 feet of imported clean soil or clean material over existing soil. Next slide, please. So this is just a breakdown of the project schedule. We broke it up into 4 phases. Phase 1, each of the phase 1, phase 3, and phase 4 were handled by the city and their contractor Quirk, and phase 2 was handled by EPA and their contractor Environmental Restoration. So phase 1 was the site preparation phase, and Quirk came in, the city's contractor Quirk came in, instituted all of the site security controls, traffic management controls, and just basically got the site ready for EPA to come in and do the bulk of the heavy lifting in terms of soil remediation. Phase 2, EPA removed soil with equal to or greater than 50 parts per million PCBs from the site, again in the area, the former area of the southwestern baseball diamond. Backfill the soil, backfilled with a mix of clean imported soil and reused soil from the site having less than 50 parts per million PCBs. Phase 3, park construction began. I should say that in phase 1, Quirk also removed and disposed of topsoil at the site. Phase 3, park construction began. This is really when we started to move out of the remediation and more into the traditional park construction. So field construction begins, the really heavy regrading of the site begins to get the site to subgrade before the cover system installations. And then phase 4 is, sort of restoration, final touches, and punch list items, and regulatory sign-off, federal regulatory sign-off, which included closure under both CERCLA, under the Emergency Response Program, and TSCA, in coordination with EPA's Region 1 PCB coordinator. Next slide, please. And so these are just a few of the measures that we worked into the design to minimize impacts on the neighborhood. We worked really hard in the design phase to make sure that these were implementable. And we worked really hard during the construction phase to make sure that they were implemented as planned. I think the contractor did a really good job of sticking to what we had planned. We set up a temporary site access and site logistics plan so that the contractor had an entrance and exit to and from the site that minimized traffic interruption and pedestrian interruption. We had a traffic management plan that included a route for truck traffic in and out of the city from the time that trucks entered city limits to the time they entered the site and back. We adhered very strictly to that. If we got wind that the trucks were not on the designated route, we sort of reached out and corrected that pretty quickly, and the contractor was good about that. We also had 24-hour dust monitoring to make sure that we were tracking and mitigating any fugitive dust leaving the site. I should say that over the entire construction period, when these monitors were out in place, we did not have any sustained exceedances of our fugitive dust action level. We also had a pretty strict soil management, soil pest management practices plan that included covering soil piles at the end of every workday and making sure that no fugitive dust escaped from those soil piles. Next slide, please. So this was our the conceptual rendering of the field, sort of in its final stages right before design, and this is what you see today. So we have the field sort of in an opposite orientation than they were previously. The site is now graded from south to north. It was previously graded from north to south. The stormwater that falls on the site, the rainwater that falls on the site is now captured in a stormwater system directed into a detention basin toward the north of the site, and either slowly infiltrated or released into the stormwater system during high rain events. Next slide, please. So this is EPA's operations. That excavator that you see is being operated by an EPA contractor with environmental restoration. This is their trucking company. EPA removed greater than 5,000 tons of PCB impacted soil, concentrations of greater than 50 ppm from the site, which is considered TSCA remediation waste under the federal regulations. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the geotextile fabric that the sort of light brown soil that you see toward the bottom left hand of this photograph is existing site soil. So having less than 50 parts per million PCBs. There's a geotextile fabric laid on top of that, and then that is the first course of drainage stone. So just a summary of the remedial action. Again, EPA removed approximately 53,000 tons of PCB impacted material. It disposed of it at a TSCA facility. The city removed, and their contractor Quirk removed 34,000 tons, approximately 34,000 tons, mostly topsoil, and it was disposed of at a non-TSCA subtitle D landfill in New Hampshire. Greater than 5,000 cubic yards was managed and reused on site under the 2 cover systems. That was very important, both to control cost and to, again, minimize the impact on the neighborhood with respect to trucking. This was all done over a 12-month construction period, 12-month, proper construction period. There was, a little bleeding on the beginning and end of that, but in earnest, it was kept mostly within a 12-month period. Next slide, please. And as everybody knows, I hope everybody knows, the park is open and has been open since spring of last year. Everybody is enjoying it, and, risk is mitigated.
Thanks, Joe. So that was the project. So how do we capture all of that in a report? Well, it's called a permanent solution statement. This is the report. Like I said, there's a lot in here. This documents all the things that we've done and the regulatory and achieves regulatory closure under the master plan. This will be filed with DEP at some point in the future. It is also auditable by DEP. So one of the great things on this project, by getting early buy-in with EPA and DEP, we could proceed with some regulatory certainty. But these complicated sites can be difficult. It's comprehensive. I'll go through the sections in a minute. It's signed and stamped by a licensed site professional, which will be myself. I'm a licensed site professional under the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is the professional designation that you need to manage the assessment and cleanup of contaminated sites within the state. And it will also be co-signed by the city. So in this report, we've got an introduction, and I'm just laying out these sections. I'm not going to go through them in much detail, but for those of you that want to review the report, this is what you're going to see. There's a site history section. Touched on that a little bit about the site history in the presentation. There's a section on all the pre-remediation response actions, the assessments, the various phases of assessments that we did. And again, Joe summarized those briefly. There's a section on the remedial alternatives and what was selected and how it was implemented. And we saw some designs that we showed earlier and how we figured that out, and also some of the schematics that went into that. And you saw photographs of the actual implementation. There's a data quality review section, which is required, where we look at the data, the thousands of pieces of data that we collected. We do an evaluation of its usability and its representativeness across the site. And that demonstrates to Mass DEP that we collected enough data, we collected in the right locations, and that we analyzed it to make sure that the quality of the data was good enough to draw conclusions on. And so there's a section on that. There's a risk characterization section where we look at exposure, and those who've been to some of the public meetings with my colleague Marie, she presented some of that information over the past couple of years on how we look at risk, how we measure risk, and how that is calculated. But if I could summarize, all the residual impacted material is below either the cover system or natural turf or the field system itself. And so it's definitely a case of no exposure, no risk of what has been left on site. There's a site closure summary, there's a public involvement plan summary, and then the last section is called the permanent solution statement, which is really kind of a bunch of questions that DP asks to make sure we've included all the elements that needs to be in this report. The activity and use limitation is supporting this project. So an activity and use limitation goes into place at a site where there are some residual impacts. What's important, though, is for the current use for this property, the site is completely safe from a risk perspective. However, we have said, and the plan always was that we weren't going to be able to keep digging, get every last cubic yard of impacted material out of there. Cost prohibitive, and it would have just taken way, way too long. With too much impact to the community, as well as trucking that material somewhere else. So the compromise is that we created a safe environment, but left material below certain depth, and the activity and use limitation acknowledges that, documents where the limits are, and also identifies what activities can be completed on the site and what ones cannot. This is also signed and stamped by an LSP and signed by the community. So these are the two documents that are available for review, that are newly available for review, and the purpose of this meeting. So this meeting commences the public comment period, extends from May 25th to June 14th. We would like folks who are interested to look at the reports. I'll explain in a second where you can find them. We'd like you to hear your comments and get comments back to the city, and then we will respond and incorporate comments as appropriate into the report. Once that's over, we will finalize the activity and use limitation. We will submit that to the Registry of Deeds. We'll then submit it to DEP and include a copy of the report. We'll sign, stamp, and submit the permanent solution statement. And just a quick aside, the public does have the right, if they want to extend that comment period, if you don't feel you have enough time to review the report, you can request a small extension to that time period. Where can these reports be found? John mentioned at the beginning, at the public library locations in the city, East Branch, Central Branch, and West Branch. There's a electronic version on the website, and we'd like public comments submitted in writing to Luisa Oliveira, who's the Director of Public Space and Urban Forestry, has been involved with this project since the beginning, and Colin Ziegler, who's the Environmental Health Coordinator for the city. We would like them in writing, because that way there's no ambiguity, and we will take those comments and address them on a comment by comment basis. So that's going to be the process going forward. And with that, we'd love to answer any questions that folks may have.
And just a reminder, along the bottom bar of Zoom, there is a raise hand feature. So you can select the raise hand feature, or feel free to add any comments into the chat bar. With that, I'm not seeing any comments or any hands raised. Give another moment.
And again, folks coming on this meeting may not have had a chance to have looked at the reports. They've been in the repository for a few days, but this begins the comment period. So the purpose of the meeting again is to inform everybody what we did and what the reports are and where they are. And so we do welcome comments within the time frame that we stipulated, and we'd love to hear from folks.
And any questions can always be emailed to either myself or Louisa. Both of those contacts are found on the Conway PIP website. Colin Ziegler can also answer any questions. With that, it seems like there are no questions or comments. So want to thank you all for attending, and thank you, George and Joe, for this wonderful presentation. I really appreciate all of the work that you've done for the city.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and it's been one of the most fulfilling projects that I've worked on. It's absolutely fantastic. The picture Joe showed at the end of the kids playing ball makes it all worthwhile. So we really appreciate the city working with us on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah,
thank you.
It's a beautiful site. Well, thank you all. I believe that ends this meeting. Any questions or comments can be forwarded to me at jbronenKant@somervillema.gov. And all of this information can be found on the Conway PIP website. Thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.